Welcome to episode 3. Today we're going to be focusing mainly on the neurobiology of trauma, because that is a topic that oftentimes is not discussed, and I feel like the lack of discussion there is the reason that we have different myths and different kind of justifications for victim blaming. So we really want to talk about the neurobiology of trauma and what's going on in a victim's brain while they are being assaulted. The first really important thing that we want to outline is that there are no normal responses to trauma. Everybody reacts differently to trauma, and you really can't predict how an individual is going to act. And it depends on the situation. You might act a certain way in one situation and completely different in another. And that's what makes it difficult. But we kind of want to outline the different general responses that there are to trauma, starting off with that of fight or flight. And so this response is pretty self-explanatory. When put into a traumatic event, an individual will either fight or run.
And then the other two common responses that often get left out of that conversation is there's also freeze and then fawning. And so freezing is when the individual is so overwhelmed, so they just actually freeze, they paralyze, they can't move, they can't say anything, there is nothing they can do. And then fawning is when the victim tries to please the offender a little bit, either to save themselves or make sure that they don't get too angry. Fawning is something that is a survival instinct that will hopefully keep them, as they think, to not be hurt as badly.
It's like a defense mechanism of sorts.
So I'm going to get a little technical here, so try and stay with me. But during an assault, what really happens is the brain signals that there's a threat, that we need to get emotions, we need to get hormones flowing because there's a threat happening, we're in danger. And so catecholamines and cortisol and opioids, oxytocin, all those hormones really start to get pumping once the brain kind of detects that this assault is happening. The problem is, though, is that the opioids, which helps prevent pain, and oxytocin, which kind of helps the good feelings, as we like to call them, they help physical survival, but they actually will harm memory and rational thought. And as those opioids will increase, that kind of creates a very flat effect, meaning that there really aren't a whole lot of emotions that are being shown. The person will become very, very numb once those opioids really start to increase.
We could also see the corticosteroids in the brain decrease, and this actually reduces energy. So kind of like a combination of all of these hormones being released, all of these effects happening in the body that, as Kay said, causes kind of like a flat affect and reduces energy. And you can see that it's pretty much the reason for the topic of tonic immobility. So what's tonic immobility? It's also known as rape-induced paralysis, and it's something that happens biologically, and it's uncontrollable. It's an uncontrollable mammalian response to extremely traumatic and fearful situations. So tonic immobility, you don't really know when it's going to hit you, but once it does, you can't escape from it. And it's just your body's way of protecting you during this traumatic event. And so when tonic immobility occurs, victims tend to increase their breathing, close their eyes, and just be basically paralyzed. And in 12 to 50% of rape victims, we can see that the phenomenon of tonic immobility was present. So it's actually quite common for someone to have this phenomenon happen to them during an assault. and it's actually more common to have it happen if you've already been assaulted prior. So if you've had multiple assaults in your lifetime, tonic immobility is most likely going to be present. And that's one of the biggest reasons why a lot of victims kind of just sit there while their assaults are happening. And it's really not fair to judge them for that, because it's a biological response that they cannot help at all. Once you enter into that tonic immobility state, you can't get out of it until the assault is over, and honestly, until your body decides that it's safe. So victims sometimes are still in tonic immobility after the assault, you know. A lot of people have been known to be left after an assault and they're just laying there and they're not moving and they're not responding, and when paramedics get to the scene, you know, they're just a blank slate, and that's their body responding to that trauma.
Definitely, and we can really see this tonic immobility in the case of Katie Costner that we kind of discussed last episode. Is her and her attacker, her date, they were arguing all night long, and he wanted to have sex and she did not. And she told the media that she was just so tired, so worn out, that finally when he just pinned her against the carpet, or against the ground, her entire body just froze. She just kind of went on autopilot, and there was nothing she could do. She couldn't move, she couldn't speak, she was totally immobilized.
And I really do want to point out that it's really unfair that we kind of have victims explain themselves as to like, why didn't you move? And you know, you can't explain this phenomenon. Like, once it's happening, your brain, it's basically like a shut off button. So you're not even really there when it's occurring. So it's so unfair when people ask victims, like, why didn't you move? Just like Katie said, she said that she was just so tired, and it's just ridiculous that she was asked to explain herself. She couldn't help it. But
exactly, yeah.
Another response that we kind of wanted to talk about was fawning. So that of pleasing or nuzzling up to an assaulter during an assault. And as we mentioned before, this is a response, it's a survival response. So victims will fawn during their assault just to try to keep themselves safe. And again, it's something biological. You know, you don't know how you're going to respond in these situations, and a lot of times compliance means, you know, yes, you're going to get assaulted, but no, he's not going to kill you. Unfortunately. And we can see this phenomenon of fawning in the case of the state of Utah versus Lonnie Norton. Heidi, the victim in all of this, when she was kidnapped and taken to that remote location that we spoke of earlier, she had to be compliant with her abuser. She was a little resistant here and there because, you know, she didn't want to be there, but she had to ultimately comply to all of his demands, because she was basically kidnapped from her home. She wasn't even wearing shoes. At gunpoint. That's the biggest thing. So during her trial, we really see the defense hone in on that fact, that she was super compliant with her abuser, and that really disregards that fawn mechanism that we can have as humans, because I mean, she was just trying to survive, and we're kind of looking at it as in, oh, she wanted to be there. So it's really harmful.
Definitely. And you can even see that afterwards when Lonnie drops her off at their place so she can check on the kids. And so at this time, Lonnie and Heidi were estranged, and she had a protective order against him, but he was still allowed to see the kids as long as he was under supervision. And so the supervisor was in the other room asleep, and she actually had to go into that room to get something, and she did not wake him up at that time. And that definitely came under scrutiny because she could have woken him up. She could have gotten help immediately. But what people don't realize is she was still in that fawn state. Is that if she would have woken Matt up, I believe his name was, if she would have woken him up and gotten help, then Lonnie was with the kids. And so she was afraid about what would happen to her, what would happen to the kids. which is why she, after checking on the kids were okay, grabbing something quick, she then kindly requested to just please take me back to my parents' house where she was staying at the time, because she just didn't want to push her luck, basically. She didn't want her kids to be hurt. She didn't want to be hurt any further. And so that even after that incident, you can still see the fawning. I think one more thing that we really forgot to kind of mention is the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn really kind of depends on habit.
Yes.
And that's kind of what helps dictate which a victim is kind of going to go for. And interestingly enough, it seems like the flight or fight ones that we are most known about, are actually the ones the most sexual assault victims are least likely to have. Because if you are in a traumatic experience, to immediately fight back actually requires a lot of training on that individual's part. Same thing with fleeing. If that victim is not trained when something traumatic happens to immediately find an escape route and go for it, that their brain won't rely on that. A lot of this is really having to do with unconscious brain choices. And your brain will tend to go for fawning and freezing, just because that seems to be what most individuals do habitually. And that's why it's so important to understand these psychological and neurological responses, because it helps explain why there's not always fighting back or yelling or some kind of escaping, which later the victim gets blamed for or judged for.
And it's important to realize that this whole neurobiology of trauma, it happens during an assault, but it can be brought up later once the victim is in a safe place. If they relive the traumatic event, this can happen all over again. And we can see this in the Chanel Miller case. After her trial, Chanel kind of, goes into a paralyzed state. She has a lot of anxiety, and you can see that that tonic immobility that we talked about, it kind of manifests in her a little bit after the trial. Because as we said before, she didn't really remember the event when she first found out about it. But after the trial, after being torn apart basically for the defense, she really had to relive the experience, and that's when it kicked in for her. So this whole process, it can happen to somebody multiple times, and we really need to be aware of that. It's simply the body's response to trauma. It's not mutually exclusive to sexual assault or sexual crimes, and I really just want to hone in on that because, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, with sexual assaults and sexual crimes, we like to isolate that and say, okay, so we have all this normal behavior that happens during traumatic events, but during sexual assaults, it's different because there's a lot of things that go into it, and that's what I often hear, oh, this is different because there's a lot of things that go into it, but we don't really understand that it's not different, and that these responses, they happen, and they can happen to anybody during any traumatic event. So we need to start treating sexual assault like any other traumatic event. It's a traumatic event, and we need to be more understanding of the victims.
Definitely, and that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind of, especially when we think about all these different hormones that are flooding this person's body as they're going through this traumatic experience. That really takes effect of their memory.
Yes.
And how those memories won't quite get stuck. A person will experience this, but those memories won't quite take hold. Sometimes they will come back little bit by little bit, but sometimes they don't come back at all.
Yeah.
And kind of what we learn in class is trying to think about it like small little post-it notes, each with little notes, but they're scattered everywhere, all over your workspace, in between random folders, on the back of your computer screen. I mean, they're just everywhere. And you're gonna go through your life, and you're just gonna find one post-it note and then maybe another post-it note, but they won't quite make sense with each other. That's kind of what traumatic memory is like for these individuals. Is slowly they're going to go through their lives, and then one thing is going to trigger something, and they're going to remember a small little fragment of their memory. And then maybe they're going to pick up another fragment, and those fragments won't make sense, but they're still fragments of that memory.
Yeah. And I do just want to point out that even though this memory has been like fragmentized, there's been studies that prove that the memories are accurate. It's just difficult to kind of decipher them because they're so, fragmented and scattered. And so that's why a lot of the times individuals don't even realize that they've been through a sexual assault until later, once they've picked up enough post-it notes and they can kind of, put that picture up and really see what happened. That's when individuals realize, and they can go through these stages of the neurobiology of trauma then as well. But I just really want to hone in on the fact that even though these memories are kind of like fragmentized, like they're accurate. The notion that victims, don't remember, we have the notion that victims won't remember, and if they do remember, it's not accurate. That's not the case. The memory will be impaired, but the memories are still in there. It's just so difficult to decipher them.
Yeah, really hard to access.
Really, really hard to access, but they are accurate. So that's why it's important to believe victims and understand that the possibility of them lying is pretty slim. So. If this story sounds familiar to you, meaning you or someone you know has experienced sexual violence, please reach out to Utah's 24/7 Sexual Violence Crisis Line at 1-888-421-1100. For help at Weber State, reach out to Safe at Weber Advocates by visiting to Shepherd Union, room 322, email safeatweber@weber.edu, or call 801-626-6090. Information is also available at weber.edu/safeatweber.